This episode is sponsored by Audible. Get a free audiobook of your choice that you get to keep with their free trial. You can learn more at lutherancartographer.com/audible. The Lutheran Cartographer, Episode 83. Welcome to the Lutheran Cartographer, the podcast where we explore what it's like to be Lutheran in different places. I'm your host, Nicholas Weber. Today we are going to Topeka, Kansas to talk to Pastor Jon Bruss. He is the senior pastor of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church. Pastor Bruss, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. It's great to be with you today.
Help orient us geographically. We're in Topeka, Kansas. Where exactly is that?
Topeka, Kansas is the capital city of the state of Kansas, and we're in the northeast corner of our state. And when our German forefathers came over, the first settlement in Kansas, the real Lutheran section, is about, interestingly, about 70 miles to the west of us. And Topeka would be, the congregation here is like a daughter of those earlier settlements just off to our west.
I see. And give us a little bit of your background. Where did you come from originally, and how did you come to Topeka?
I grew up in the Milwaukee area, in the greater Milwaukee area. My family are, I think they're kind of like two ancient strands of Missouri Synod people. One is the Saxons who came up the Mississippi in 1838, and the other one is the Pomeranians who came up the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1838. And I'm a descendant of the Pomeranians who came up the St. Lawrence. They settled in a little area northwest of Milwaukee called Freistadt, Wisconsin, Free City, Wisconsin, and established Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church. And so I'm actually an eighth-generation Missouri Synod Lutheran, which is kind of a fun thing to be able to say. And then my seminary education was actually not within our synod. I went to Bethany Lutheran Theological Seminary, the seminary of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, not to be confused with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and was colloquized into Missouri Synod in 2000 and, I think it was 2003 or 2006, probably 2006, and received a call to Topeka in 2013.
I see. So tell us a little bit more about the contrast that you've seen from sort of the eastern Midwest and the western Midwest.
The eastern Midwest and the western Midwest, that's very interesting. So the contrast kind of between like growing up Lutheran in Milwaukee and being a Lutheran in Kansas, is that kind of what you're after?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the most startling things, growing up Lutheran in Milwaukee, you think everybody is either Catholic, Missouri Synod, or Wisconsin Synod. And I think R.J. Newhouse once put it this way. He said he and the Catholic kids, they all walked on the same block to school, went in separate doors because the Catholics went across the street from the Lutheran school, and they knew one thing about each other, and that was that they were each going to hell. I'm not certain it was that strong when I was growing up in the Milwaukee area, but definitely a sense of, the religious lines were definitely Lutheran or Catholic. And within Lutheranism, of course, the kind of historic fault lines were pretty visible as well between Wisconsin Synod and Missouri Synod. Here in Kansas, it's a different beast altogether. Methodism has had a huge influence on this state. And so that kind of Methodistic culture is much stronger here. There are, of course, Catholics, but Lutherans are certainly not as predominant as they are in southeast Wisconsin.
I see. What are some of the ways that you see that Methodist influence?
What's fascinating about that is that, of course, now with an almost nationalized culture, that those what I observe here is probably also observable in Milwaukee, where I haven't lived for eons. So, but there's a much greater openness, I think, to like evangelical radio. I don't know what they call it, K-Love or something like that, is what a lot of people listen to, and that infiltration from those voices is part of the backdrop against which a lot of our teaching and preaching needs to take place in order to clarify what we mean as Lutherans versus what the broader evangelical world might mean. So you can do it on all sorts of different levels. What does being saved mean, right? And this is a problem across the United States of America. Evangelicals mean one thing. Lutherans mean an entirely different thing. Lutherans mean Christ has died for my sins, and not my sins only, but for the sins of the whole world. I'm baptized into him, and through faith alone lay hold of all of his merits, which is itself a gift of him to me. That's not what it means in evangelicalism or Methodism. It's not too long ago either that Kansas was a pretty heavy blue law state, and it's really funny to come from Wisconsin, where most churches have it seems like have a beer cellar in the basement, to a place where even Lutherans regard drinking beer at church somewhat askance. So that's just a sort of cultural thing.
Yeah, I see. Well, let's turn to the question of what are some of the good things about Topeka?
Yeah, well, we are in the state capital, and that's actually pretty exciting. All the action in terms of governing the state happens less than a mile from where our congregation is located, which is really neat. And oftentimes, particularly during Lent and Advent, when we have a noontime Wednesday service, we'll have legislators and others who work at the Capitol and don't otherwise come to our church simply because they're in from out of town, and that's always fun for us. Topeka is a very salt of the earth kind of place. The people are very down to earth, and you would not call it a highbrow town at all. And I think Topeka wears that kind of as a badge of honor, and in a way that just goes really nicely with Lutheranism, because Lutheranism is if nothing else, the story of how God gets his fingernails dirty in the lives of sinners and saves them. And I do appreciate the people here an awful lot. There just is not a lot of pretense, which is a wonderful, I suppose, population characteristic when you're trying to be a pastor. There's not a lot of shells necessarily that you got to crack in order to get down to where you can do the pastoral work.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So there seems to be a lot less, as you were saying, just a lot less sort of pretension or masking of people then?
Yes, that's absolutely true. Now, not that we as sinners don't always wear our masks. I'm not saying that at all. But I think as a general rule of thumb, what you just said, it would be absolutely true about serving God's people in Topeka.
Good deal. Let's talk about the flip side. What are some of the challenges about the area?
Yeah, we have significant challenges here. So at one point, as recently as 1995, there were 7 Missouri Synod congregations in Topeka. St. John's is the grandma of all of them. So just as we're the daughter of those congregations to the west, we are the grandma and mother of all the remaining congregations here in Topeka. So in 1995 or so, St. Paul's was defunct. Another one went closed in 2016, and so we're down to 5 Missouri Synod congregations in town, and meanwhile, the the LCMS population as a kind of percentage of the entire Topeka population has declined in a considerable way. What is fascinating about this, you can find these religious affiliation studies that are done kind of on a 5 to 10 year basis. The whole amount of Christians in Topeka has not changed materially at all since 1995. But Topeka now has over 10,000 non-denominational evangelicals, whereas in 1995, I think if I recall this correctly, there were 53.
Wow.
So what's happening is the big box operations are pulling the people off, which is really problematic. And, our forebears taught what they taught, not seeing some of the trains coming down the tracks. And I don't think anybody in the Evangelical Lutheran Church, in Missouri Synod congregations, was ready for the onslaught of the big box evangelical operation. And unfortunately, a lot of the people got drawn away by it. So that's a major challenge, I would say. We also have a stagnant population. It has not changed, again, materially since 1972. And so it's not like we're, in suburban America where in the olden days you took out a stake with a sign and pounded it in a corner and said Missouri Synod Church is meeting here next Sunday and had 200 people show up. We're an old, stable congregation in a very immobile population in a lot of ways.
I see. Are there any other challenges outside of the religious aspect to living in Topeka, or is the religious aspect kind of the one that weighs the most heavily?
Well, that's the only one I think of. And, being a Northerner, the heat of the summers doesn't sit well with me.
Yeah.
But that's just a personal challenge on my part. Yeah.
I see. Well, let's go on and talk a little bit more about Lutheranism in the area. We've already covered it pretty well. And is there anything else about being in this more Methodist atmosphere or the atmosphere of this kind of long storied congregation that has been the mother and grandmother church of many things that we haven't mentioned that we'd like to touch on before we talk about other things?
That's a good question. I don't even know if this is appropriate for your podcast, but I'll mention it anyway. Our district has seen a sea change in leadership, and I would argue much for the better. There's been a much more. I want to be careful how I say this. A decided turn toward traditional Lutheranism, and that, by my lights, has been a very good thing for our district. It's much easier to define oneself when, as a Lutheran, when everybody else in the district is defining themselves as Lutherans, in very clear ways, this and not that. So that's been a fascinating change that we've seen over the last since really 2015, when now first vice president of the Synod, Peter Lang, was elected the district president, and that trajectory continues in Kansas. And I frankly believe it's one of the most exciting districts to be serving in right now in our Synod because of that, because of the vigor of our confession at work.
That is excellent to hear. Let's take a moment to thank our sponsor. If you enjoy listening to audio and to the Lutheran Cartographer, you will also enjoy Audible. It's a service from Amazon that gets you a audiobook of your choice every month, and you can also try out the service for free for 30 days. That comes with a free audiobook that you get to keep even if you decide not to continue with their service. Check it out at lutherancartographer.com/audible. If you're looking for a book to explore this month, I would recommend checking out Pastor Will Wheaton's Thank, Praise, Serve, and Obey, Recovering the Joys of Piety. It's a book about Lutheran piety, not pietism, and it was a great blessing to me as I listened to it on my trip out to Missouri. So check it out at lutherancartographer.com/audible. Let's get back to our guest. Let's turn now to the question of what it's like to raise a family there in Topeka.
Yeah, Topeka, it's interesting. You probably have talked to others about this. California is emptying out, and people are moving back to the Midwest, and Topeka is not. It's not kind of an epicenter for that by any stretch of the imagination, but this is the kind of place that's regarded by lots of people as a very good place to raise a family. It's not a huge town, 125,000 total. I can get from one place to another on most days within 10 minutes, which is, ridiculous. I'm telling this to a guy who's been in Seattle and St. Louis, and I know it's nothing like that where you're at. But there are some tough, some rough edges here in Topeka as well. Our congregation is in the pretty rough neighborhood. Let's put it this way, it's seen its better days. We have lots of turnover and lots of rental housing around here. Just to give you an example of this, of what this is like, it was this spring. I was working away in my office on a sermon, and I hear bam, 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 and look out, and there's a guy at the corner where our church is located on a motorcycle, doing donuts in the middle of the intersection, shooting a gun in the air. So there's a lot of and out of my window looking to the north, I can see what I'm certain is a drug dealer's house. Lots of traffic in and out, and lots of police visits. So those are the rough edges of Topeka. The outlying areas, of course, like in so many urban areas, have lots of, really stable suburban kinds of situations where you have middle and upper middle class houses. But you've got that mix in Topeka, and that's a very clear mix. This is also the place where Brown v. took place. Are you aware of that? Brown v. Board of Education?
I've heard of that
landmark case.
Yeah.
Yeah, landmark case. So there was a point in time when racial tension was very high in Topeka. And interestingly enough, I don't see that any longer. There's, there are white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods, but I just don't see any sort of overt racism at all.
Interesting. What are the educational options available for families?
We have got a Lutheran school, which is, really a wonderful thing to have. It was the school of St. John, so it used to be St. John's School from prior to the actual organization of the congregation. There was for about a year a school, and that gave rise to the congregation. So that would have been back in the congregation was founded in 1874, so the school would have started in 1873. By 1953, St. John's had spawned a bunch of daughter congregations and decided to turn their school into an association school. So they bought a new property in a growing part of town, which is now very much the inner part of town. And at one point in time, there were 330 kids in that school from all of the local congregations in Topeka. Over time, for various reasons, financial and other, the remaining congregations fell out of the association, leaving St. John's, Faith Lutheran, and Christ Lutheran as the sole members of the association. And so we regard Topeka Lutheran School as our school, and that's a K-8 institution. It's got a daycare and preschool connected with it. So that's a very helpful thing for Lutherans in raising their families. Raising a Lutheran family is a three-legged stool. It's what happens at home. It's what happens in the divine service on Sunday morning and actually participating in it, and it's what happens in the Lutheran school. And when those three legs are in place, you raise Lutherans. When they're not, you reduce your chances of passing on the faith. So our school is a real prize to us. From that point on, we've just got all we've got is public school options. So there are in Greater Topeka probably 5 or 6 high schools, some in Topeka proper and some in the outlying areas. People, I think, generally favor those in the outlying areas to those in the inner areas. And then we've also got a university here called Washburn University. It's basically an open access public institution, and it's just a couple miles from us. We have at St. John's, we've got an LCMSU chapter, and try to serve Missouri Synod students from Washburn University at our church.
Well, let's turn now to one of the fun parts of the podcast where we talk about what are some things that you'd recommend seeing, hidden gems or not so hidden gems, restaurants, things to do, museums. If you had a friend coming into town, what would you recommend that they see?
Oh, boy, I'll tell you what. Topeka's got some great stuff to see. The Capitol building is the neatest Capitol building I've ever been in. And if you go in there on a day when it's not too windy, you can even go up through the dome out onto the parapet and, stand on the outside of the dome and get this fantastic view of the area. But that is a must-see thing. I think everybody's got to see the state capitol. There's a children's museum here. We've lived in Topeka long after we had any little munchkins. So I've never been to the children's museum, but people love it. You're going to love this, Nick. The Evil Knievel Museum is located in Topeka.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So if you've got little boys and you're looking for a weekend away and you're in the Midwest, come to the Evil Knievel Museum and then come to church at St. John's on Sunday. That's how it would work.
Excellent.
Yeah, and we've got our park system is quite nice actually, and there is a time in the spring, and I think it varies a little bit based upon weather, kind of maybe early April typically, called tulip time, and they plant, I have no idea. I've seen the numbers published somewhere. It's hundreds of thousands and maybe even millions of tulip bulbs in the public parks around here, and it's just really a sight to behold. It's kind of like you're transported to the Netherlands. So those are some of the neat things, and then nearby we've got this neat geographical feature called the Flint Hills, which is this stretch of virgin prairie that runs from Nebraska, the Kansas-Nebraska border down to the Kansas-Oklahoma border. And these hills have, they've got limestone right underneath the surface of the soil. And the farmers, the settlers couldn't plow it. So it's remained unscathed, and it's just a sight to behold. There, in many places, just you couldn't see a tree if you turn 360 degrees, but these hills just sort of roll, and it's this beautiful grass, and it changes color all the time. It's really worth checking out if you come to Topeka.
Wonderful. If you had to recommend 1 or 2 restaurants, what would you highlight?
Oh, 1 or 2 restaurants. Well, it depends upon what kind of food you like. I definitely would recommend Jong's Thai Kitchen, which is just dangerously close to our church. Yeah, they've got fantastic food. It's a really tiny place. You got to have a reservation if you want to eat there, but it's absolutely worth it. Yeah, and then food characteristic of the area. There's another place called Lonicue's Barbecue, and Lonicue is this guy who's got such a barbecue recipe that, I mean, I can't remember what it is. He might be open like 2 or 3 days a week. That's it, for just a couple hours a day. That's when you got to get it. If you don't get it then, you ain't getting it.
Wow.
And people line up out the door. If you go there for lunch, you better plan on staying for a couple hours, because you're going to be an hour in line just to get in the door.
Wow. All right. Good deal. So, Pastor Bruss, as we start to close out the podcast, I want to make sure to give you the opportunity to highlight anything that you'd like, your church's website, places to follow you online. Where would you like to point our listeners?
Yeah, well, definitely our church's website. If you Google St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, Topeka, Kansas, you'll find us. And that's a great place to find a lot of information about our congregation. And have you been there yourself? Have you looked at our website?
I have. It's stjohnlcmstopeka.org.
Correct, yeah. And I think hopefully as you look at that website, you get in pictures. The pictures project what we are as a congregation, and we sum it up with 3 words: traditional, confessional, and liturgical. And I think our website is actually a really fantastic thing, and tells our story pretty well. And really, to tell our story is to tell the story of Christ at work in His church, forgiving sins. So I love our website. And did you say, are there any other places you want me to point people?
Yeah, if you have a blog, or just was curious if there was anything else you'd like to point our listeners to.
Absolutely. The associate pastor and I have our own podcast. It's called the Plucked Chicken Podcast, and I can tell you about the name in a sec. Let's see. This is available at thepluckedchicken.com. And my colleague used to be an evangelical and became a Lutheran, and so he's got a lot of interesting things to say, and so this podcast is devoted to kind of rummaging through the attic of Lutheranism and evangelicalism, and really demonstrating the ways in which evangelicalism, despite its many claims to be biblical and so on and so forth, simply misses the mark. And so it's a polemical podcast. If people are into polemics, they probably enjoy that one an awful lot. Thepluckedchicken.com.
Fantastic. Dear listener, you'll find links to both St. John's webpage and to the Plucked Chicken podcast at the show notes page for the episode, which will be at lutherancartographer.com/83. Pastor Bruss, thank you so much for your time today. What are your parting thoughts for our listeners?
My parting thoughts for our listeners would be that the gospel that we are privileged as Lutherans to have received from the faithful transmission over so many centuries, and from the Lord Himself, is too precious to give up. And I would pray that every single Lutheran would embrace it wholeheartedly, and understand it, seek to understand it. And the more you seek to understand it, the more comfortable you're going to be in talking about it. And the more comfortable you are in talking about it, the more naturally it's going to enter your conversation, and the more people are going to be drawn to the beautiful gospel of the free forgiveness of sins in Jesus Christ.
Wonderful. Thank you again. God's peace.
God's peace. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks for listening to the Lutheran Cartographer. For more about the things that we talked about today, check out the show notes page. That'll be at lutherancartographer.com/83. I want to remind you of that Audible offer. You can go to lutherancartographer.com/audible to take advantage of that. And until next time, I'm Nicholas Weber. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.